Hey everyone, this is Miss Valentine, and you are watching the Biomes notes here in AP Environmental Science. The biomes are a good follow up to our conversation about climate earlier in this week. Biomes are essentially just ecosystems that all share similar characteristics. Um, the biggest factors are precipitation and temperature, and based on that, you end up with a number of different biomes that are identified as you see here on this map. And we'll talk a little bit more about each specific one. And unfortunately, with biomes, there's no super easy way to study it. You kind of just have to memorize the characteristics about different types of biomes. And I believe that your NGL Sync textbook has flashcards in the chapter. So that might be a very useful thing, especially when you're studying biomes this week. So our first biome we're going to look at are deserts, and we classify deserts into three different areas depending on their latitude. So deserts in general have very low precipitation. So their evaporation exceeds precipitation. So you have a lot of sunlight usually that helps to evaporate the area. And then depending on where you're at, the temperature might also contribute to that, the heat. Deserts are usually found between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Those are the two latitude lines that run right in the middle of the northern and southern hemispheres. And deserts cover about 30% of Earth's land, mostly again between those two lines of latitude we just mentioned. There's also some deserts created due to the rain shadow effect, one of the concepts we talked about in the previous notes on weather and climate. When there's a mountain, it blocks precipitation from getting to the other side of the mountain, the inland side of the mountain, and you end up having a desert there. Because there's not a lot of water, and there's also a lot of excessive heat, you might have little vegetation in the area. And so the sand or dirt, if it's dirt, can tend to blow around a lot. So it's not a great habitat for a lot of plants. In a desert biome, the flora or the plants that you'll see will be deep rooted because they have to get to groundwater. If there are shallow roots, then they might have more difficulty surviving. However, they can have different types of leaves that can stay dormant longer during dry spells. So you see cacti and you see succulent type plants that could have shallow roots, but their leaves do not require, or their structures do not require as much rain. Um, they do store biomass in the seeds within them, the plants do. And then after a rain, those seeds can bloom and germinate and bloom, and then produce new seeds and die. So the lifespan or the life cycle of the desert plants are very unique compared to other biomes on Earth. Fauna, or the animals, tend to come out at night. A lot of nocturnal critters in the desert, and they have a lot of adaptations for conserving water since there is very little water in deserts. Spiders are common in desert environments, and then a lot of these animals and insects can become dormant during certain periods of time when it's excessively hot. So they can basically put themselves to sleep and wake up when the conditions are more favorable. Now, all deserts do have a low level of precipitation, though they tend to have more during the winter months. The temperature range can vary based on the latitude of the desert. So, in a tropical desert, that would be between the two lines, Capricorn and Cancer, closer to the equator, you have high temperatures all year round. There's pretty consistent sunlight on the equator all year long. And then you don't have very many plants at all, as you can see in this picture here. Barely some grasses here hanging on. And then this is what you would typically see in like the Sahara Desert in Africa, these big sand dunes that move around and change throughout the year. In a temperate desert, which is in the temperate zone of latitude, you're going to see more variation in the amount of rainfall, at least in the winter months, you'll have more. But the temperature also varies, similar to what it does in our temperate area that we live in. You have cold temperatures in the winter and then warmer temperatures in the summer. But it tends to be a little bit more moderated, I guess you could say. It's not super, super hot. and not terribly, terribly cold. Vegetation is sparse, but you do have a lot more vegetation here than you see in the tropical areas, simply because there's just so much heat that it takes a lot of the water away in the tropical desert. So Mojave Desert in California is a good example, and that one in particular is also affected by the mountains in the region. A polar desert has a lot larger variation in temperatures, mostly because there are certain times of year when it gets a lot of sunlight, a lot longer sunlight. And then there are other times of years when there is a great deal more darkness. So the temperature variation is actually pretty great in a polar desert. It does get pretty cold, but it can also get fairly warm when you have sunlight for most of the day. The precipitation, of course, is year-round low. So again, it's a little bit different than the tropical and the temperate desert, but again, low precipitation is what makes a desert. The Gobi Desert in China is an example of that. A temperate desert food web might include a lot of very drought-resistant plants, like I mentioned, things that can hold moisture for a long time. They have structures that don't require a great deal of water and that can withstand high temperatures. Because the diversity of plants is very low, you have a lower diversity of animals as well. So you do have all levels. In most deserts, you have a lot of producers, but the fewer producers you have, the fewer varieties of consumers you can have as well. So deserts tend to have lower than average biodiversity compared to other biomes, like the ones that we're going to study in the next few slides. So the human impact on deserts, they take a long time to recover from human disturbance, specifically because there is such low biodiversity. Plants grow slowly there. They take a lot longer to take root in an area. And nutrient cycling is very slow. A lot of that has to do with the shortage of water in the area. So any vegetation that's destroyed in a desert area could take decades to grow back, just because you don't have the water there to help drive cycles out in the desert. So desert cities can be particularly damaging to the biomes that are in that area. All right, here we are at our first pit stop, and all of the pit stops today are going to ask about the temperature and precipitation common to desert biomes. So you can discuss the three different ones. You could focus on just one of them. All of the pit stops today are going to start asking about temperature and precipitation, and then the second question for all of your pit stops today will be, is there high, low, or medium biodiversity as a result of those conditions? So pause the video at this point and take a moment to fill in your answer for the desert biomes. Our second general biome category we'll discuss here is grasslands. And grasslands are kind of an in-between biome compared from desert to forests. So let's talk about some of the different types that we see. There's another word, chaparral. That's another type of grassland that's very specific. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But grasslands are generally located between 55 degrees north and 30 degrees south. So it doesn't expand as far south, partially because there's not as much land in the southern hemisphere. And grasslands have a little bit more precipitation than deserts, but not so much that large trees can grow. They're also really susceptible to fires, and so those fires can wipe out vegetation and prevent the growth of large stands of trees. A lot of them are found on the inside of continents. So grasslands like the prairies in the US, they are too moist for desert, too dry for forest. So like I said, it's kind of an in-between. However, the weather conditions make fertile soil, so the extra moisture can help break down, decompose things, and it makes more fertile soil. So a lot of that is the reason why we have a lot of farmland in the prairie area in the Great Plains of the United States. Savannas, they are tropical grasslands, so they're closer to the equator, and they do have trees. They're just more scattered about, and then you have herds of animals that like to roam there. They prefer the grasses and the different types of vegetation that are there. Chaparral is a more moderate climate. A lot of times it's in coastal areas, and it's actually usually associated with the Mediterranean Sea. But there are chaparral type climates in the United States, mostly out in the west in the mountain areas. But basically, what it is just shrubs and dry brush, and it's often subject to fire, so you don't have a growth of trees in those areas. So in grasslands, grass obviously is the dominant vegetation. You have very tall grasses, not like the grass that we have in our yards. And then there's also wildflowers. So think of prairies in the Midwest. You see a lot of different wildflowers, different varieties. The animals that you would find on a grassland environment would be dependent on the location. So if it's in the tropical region, you're thinking of the African savanna, zebras, rhinoceroses, gazelles. If you are in the United States in the prairie areas, you would have prairie dogs, jackrabbits, deer. So it just depends on the continent that you are on and the latitude at which you are located. So a tropical grassland, the big feature here is that there's a very big difference between summer and winter. So in the summertime, it's very, very dry. You can see here in this precipitation chart, the whole summer is extremely dry. And then in the wintertime, you have tons of vegetation. So this is what you see in the African savanna, which is north or north and south outside of the tropical rainforest area. So this is a really great place for grazing animals. And the herbivores in the tropical grassland environments, they have evolved in a way that there is not a great deal of competition among the herbivore species. Therefore, you have a very good balance of of ecological community cooperation, I guess you could say. They've reached their climax community where they're in good shape in that regard. There's plenty of food for everyone. But again, the big difference for tropical grasslands is that you have this sharp difference between precipitation in the summer and in the winter. And here is a typical tropical grassland food web. You can see there are a lot of apex predators, and there are fewer in terms of species, fewer species of herbivores down here to feed those apex predators. So like I mentioned, competition among the herbivores, the primary consumers, has developed in such a way that they don't compete as much with one another. So they have a good balance in those ecosystems. A temperate grassland, this would be more what we think of with the American prairie. You do have seasons, much like most of the temperate zone. So you have winter where the temperatures are cooler and the temperatures get hotter in the summer. And then the precipitation, it also varies, but you do get plenty of precipitation to provide this lush green fertile land. Now, the high precipitation in this area also helps to produce fertile soil because plants break down and get into the surface of the soil. So that organic matter makes it really good for farming, and that's why we see in the Midwest or even the Plains states, really, where there were lots of prairies. There still are, but we've turned a lot of that into farmland because of the fertile soil that is there. Now, unfortunately, the farming of that land can leave it vulnerable to erosion because you don't have as much vegetation, natural vegetation, holding the soil in place. So you end up depleting the land much quicker when you turn it into farmland that we use to produce food for people. Here is a typical temperate grassland, and it looks very familiar to what you might see in the prairie section of the zoo. You have coyotes and prairie dogs, and then different primary consumers, secondary consumers, and birds of prey for your apex predators, your tertiary consumers. A polar grassland is what we think of as an Arctic tundra. So it gets very, very cold. They do have a seasonal warm period, but it's not extremely warm. So the ground will stay frozen year long, and that is called permafrost. It's just a frozen layer of soil. And when it's frozen like that, it doesn't allow water in, and it also doesn't allow any trapped gases to come out. Now, a concern that we have in our current climate change situation is that a lot of the permafrost is melting. Higher and higher latitudes, you see more permafrost melting, and that releases methane gas and any other gases that have been trapped in there. Methane gas, we know, is a greenhouse gas, and so that contributes to more warming. It's a positive feedback loop. Soil in a polar grassland is not as fertile as in other grassland areas because you don't have the decomposition as a result of all of these cold temperatures. So the soil is not great quality for growing things, and that's why you see even in this scene here, like the vegetation is very low. There aren't a lot of nutrients there for plants to really grow large. And then on top of it, you also have it's very cold for plants. So a tundra or permafrost or Arctic tundra is a type of grassland. It's just a very low vegetation type of grassland. Here is a typical polar grassland. So you can see our grizzly bears, our apex predator, but you do have a low variety of species, which is pretty common when you get into the polar regions. You're going to see less biodiversity in those areas. Now, our human impact on grasslands include what I was talking about, turning the grassland into cropland. So you're using that fertile soil, but if you look at this picture here, you can see how erosion might easily strip away the soil. The release of CO2 is a natural result of burning anything, wood, grass, trees. So burning that turns the CO2 into the atmosphere. Overgrazing can cause all sorts of problems for an ecosystem. If you take away the base of the food chain, the producers, it can cause more problems for natural species. And then just in the tundra, in the Arctic area, you have a lot of oil, especially in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge in the US, you have oil exploration. So there's water pollution. We also have the melting of the permafrost, like we mentioned. And so that all is very difficult to recover from. Here we are at our next pit stop on the grasslands. So choose one of the three, tropical, temperate, or polar grassland, and describe the temperature and precipitation common to that temperate grassland biome. And again, this is temperature and precipitation is essentially what is used to determine climate. So that's why I'm asking about those two things. Then answer if there is high, low, or medium biodiversity as a result of those conditions. And you can pause the video at this point to answer these questions. Our next general biome category is forests. And forests are going to require a lot more precipitation in order to build the vegetation that is needed to make a forest, to make trees. But they do vary on latitude, based on latitude. So forests have enough precipitation to support stands of trees, which is just another word for forests. And they're found in all different regions. The type of vegetation, of course, will vary based on where they are in terms of latitude. Tropical rainforests, they have a lot of diversity because they have a lot of rain and they're warm all year long. So those are hotbeds for biodiversity. There is often a uniform warm temperature and high humidity, even if the amount of rain fluctuates. I think it's drier in the summer, but they still have a great deal of humidity. The temperate deciduous forests, those are what we see around us. The leaves survive by shedding their trees survive by shedding their leaves, and that actually promotes a lot of nutrient-rich soil, because as those leaves get buried, they turn into soil, and that has organic matter. So just think of your biogeochemical cycles, your nitrogen and your phosphorus, carbon, all of that getting back into the soil makes it very fertile for other vegetation the following year. And then in polar regions, you see more evergreen coniferous forests, although you do see coniferous trees around here too. And those are your needle trees, the ones that keep their leaves all year long, or their needles. Needles are their leaves, technically. So we see all of those. You can see them in temperate zones and in polar zones. So let's talk about the tropical rainforest first. You can see they have a huge amount of rainfall. Again, it's a little bit drier in the summer months. However, there is enough rainfall to keep it moist to make it humid there. And the temperature is so high. All of those are great conditions for life. So the biodiversity there is large. It makes up about 2% of Earth's land surface, but it's 50 to 80% of terrestrial or land species. So that's a huge level of biodiversity. They're still discovering new species of animals in the rainforest and plants. So this is our tropical rainforests are in the equator, around the equator, especially in South America, Africa, and then Indonesia as well, and South Asia. So lots of great biodiversity in these areas and some concerns about them being destroyed that we'll talk about later in this. It'll be a few chapters from now. Here is a technical or like one small food web within a tropical rainforest. You can see there's a lot more biodiversity there. They do have fungi, bacteria, decomposers, breaking things down, affecting all these different forms of life. So it's a pretty complex ecosystem. And this is not even showing like half or even a third of the biodiversity. There is a lot more than this. Here is a picture showing different canopies have different biodiversity. So you have a very tall layer here, the canopy layer. This has its own animals and food webs up in the higher levels, different from what you find down at the bottom. So there's different things that live in different parts, different layers of the rainforest. The temperate forest is what we're familiar with, and actually this picture is pretty consistent. Maybe it was a few weeks ago what we saw. The temperatures change throughout the year, so you have a cold season and a warm season, but precipitation is generally consistent. It changes a little bit, but it's not a huge drop-off at any certain point. So what's good about them, though, is that these leaves that fall off the trees serve as nutrients for future generations, future vegetation. So there are less varieties of species than you'd find in a tropical rainforest because there's not as warm a temperatures and not as much precipitation. But there's still a great deal of biodiversity to be found in temperate forests. So here is our typical temperate forest food web, similar to what you might find in Sharon Woods. I haven't seen any long-tailed weasels lately, but this is definitely consistent with what we would see close to us. An evergreen coniferous forest tends to be in the polar regions, although you do see some in the temperate regions as well. Evergreen trees are south of the Arctic tundra, so Canada especially has a lot of these full coniferous forests. They have long, dry winters and cold winters, obviously, and you might also have a variation of sunlight. So they might have very, very dark winters and very, very bright summers. There isn't a lot of decomposition that takes place because of the cooler temperatures. Similar to the tundra, you don't have as much decomposition. So it also has high soil acidity in that region. And I think that just has to do with the composition of the rocks that have been eroded. And the coniferous trees actually do have a degree of acidity. Part of the reason why nothing ever grows underneath them is because those needles are very acidic. It creates very acidic soil that no other vegetation likes to grow in. Every once in a while, you'll see a dandelion under an evergreen tree, but for the most part, they keep the forest floor pretty clear of other types of vegetation. So here is a typical food web in a polar forest land. You see white spruce here, and these are all evergreen trees. So again, we see a lot of evergreen trees around us in this area, and I think that's because we do have a significant winter in this temperate area. Human impacts on forests are pretty obvious. We think of our timber clear cutting and deforestation that takes place for agriculture, especially. The Amazon rainforest was in the news in recent years because their president has allowed for a lot of burning of the rainforest to build farmland to help with the economy, but they're ruining the environment. Um, our big problem in the United States is in the West, the Northwest especially. Timber is a big market, and there is a lot of reduction in diversity when you cut down older forests. So and replant it with a standard wood, a type of wood that you would want to cut for lumber. So like pine or chestnut. So urban development is another thing that can cause problems in these forested areas. And then when you turn, this is what I was talking about, these tree farms. Basically, you're planting a forest that is all one type of tree, and that really cuts down on your diversity further up the food chain when you replace old growth forests with this new lumber oriented forest. Here we are at the pit stop for forest biomes. So describe the temperature and precipitation common to, I put specifically this time, tropical forest biomes. And then is there high, low, or medium biodiversity as a result of those conditions? So again, you're talking about tropical rainforest biomes. I'll pause the video while you answer the question. And our final general biome category is mountains. So you can have latitude is the major impactor of climate because of how much sunlight an area gets. But mountains in a region, topography can make a huge difference in how the climate is in an area. So higher elevation, they actually have their own special type of biodiversity. If there are snow-covered peaks, you're not going to find as much life up on those peaks, but closer to the edges of those, you see a lot of unique biodiversity. The snow-covered peaks reflect sunlight, and then they can slowly release water when it warms up in the springtime, and that just kind of waters the plants and keep things in good shape throughout the year. Nowadays, in the case of climate change, you're not getting as much snow on these peaks, and so the vegetation further downstream is impacted by that. So mountain biomes are a large portion of our land, about 20%. And everything changes when you move up a mountain. The temperature changes, the amount of water available can change. Mountains are prone to erosion if there's not a significant amount of vegetation there. If there are forests, which there are a lot of forests on mountains, they tend to be a little bit safer. Lumber companies are not as interested in cutting down trees on mountains just because of the difficulty associated with that. There's also endemic species, which are just species that you don't find anywhere else in the world. You find them only in a certain area. And they can be sanctuaries for animal species that have been driven out of areas where humans have developed, the lowland areas, foothills. And these mountains can help regulate the climate. With the snow on the tops of mountains, you reflect solar radiation back into space rather than having it absorbed into the earth to then be re-emitted. Mountain biomes also affect the sea level because of housing or protecting, insulating glacial ice. And then the mountains are also a big factor in the hydrologic cycle because, like I said, they help to insulate the glacial ice and then release that ice when things get warmer. And so in our current, again, warming situation, glacial ice, it's actually able to last longer if it's in a mountain range than if it is just out in the open. We humans, of course, have a big impact on mountain biomes as well. We cause a lot of species to have to migrate uphill in order to escape habitat destruction and human settlement further downhill. And so those species either adapt or they really struggle to survive. Timber extraction is just a fancy word for cutting down trees. So if we take out the trees, you take out producers in an ecosystem, it's going to disrupt that ecosystem. We also extract minerals from mountainsides because if you think about the geologic activity that produces mountains, a lot of that convergent activity creates minerals in the earth. And so we disrupt the area when we try to go in there and take that out. We'll have an entire chapter on mining in the future. We also see a lot of tourism in nice forested areas because people like to get out into the natural world, which isn't a bad thing. However, it can cause some damage to the area. Definitely, you see more pollution and roads and salt and things like that can disrupt ecosystems as well. Hydroelectric dams are common in mountains because you need a elevation difference in order for the falling water to turn a turbine. You have air pollution that can find its way, get trapped inside a mountain range, and then ozone depletion or O3 depletion results because we were releasing certain pollutants into the atmosphere closer to the ozone layer. So you have a depletion of the ozone layer, which allows more UV light to go through. And we'll study ozone and the chemicals that can actually destroy it in another chapter further down. Now, here we are at our summary. This week, you're writing a 5 sentence summary about biomes, and make sure you're discussing the impact of precipitation, temperature, and human activity on the variety of Earth's biomes. Once again, I mentioned precipitation and temperature are the main drivers of what makes a climate. So that's why those concepts are important.